Your fingernails are black. Not dirty black, not garden soil black, but a deep, permanent ground-in black that has worked its way under the nail bed and into the creases of your knuckles so thoroughly that you've stopped trying to scrub it out. It is 4 a.m. in Boston in the year 1718, and you're 12 years old, and the smell that fills your nose the instant you wake is hot metal and rancid tallow, and your own unwashed body pressed flat against a straw mattress that has not been turned in months. You do not get to lie there and enjoy the darkness. Your brother James is already awake in the next room, and if you are not standing at the composing stone before he calls your name a second time, he will come in here and drag you off the mattress by the ankle, the way he did 3 weeks ago when you overslept after staying up past midnight reading by a stolen candle stub. Your back still remembers the floor. This is the problem you wake up with every single morning of your apprenticeship, and it has nothing to do with printing and everything to do with your body. Nobody in this house believes that a body needs tending. Washing is something you do to a shirt, not to skin. Your master, who is also your brother, thinks bathing more than once a season opens the pores to disease, thins the blood, invites fevers that will kill you faster than the dirt ever could. Half of Boston agrees with him. The other half doesn't think about it at all, because there isn't time. There isn't water that isn't already needed for drinking and cooking and dyeing rags, and there certainly isn't privacy. Not in a house where 4 apprentices and 2 family members and sometimes a lodger all share 2 rooms and a loft. So you lie there in the dark for that half second before the smell hits you, the way it always does, the way it will for years, and then you get up because lying there doesn't change anything and the type won't set itself. Your feet find the floor before your eyes have properly adjusted, and the boards are cold enough that you can feel every knot and splinter through the thin soles of the stockings you slept in. You did not undress last night. Nobody in this loft undresses fully to sleep in winter, not with the wind finding every gap in the wattle and daub, and so you wake already dressed in yesterday's shirt, the linen gone stiff at the collar with 3 days of sweat, and you do not think about that stiffness, because thinking about it changes nothing, and there is no fresh shirt waiting regardless. James is at the composing stone when you come down the ladder, his sleeves already rolled, his own hands stained the same permanent black yours are becoming. He does not look up. "Late," he says. It is not a question. "I'm here." "You're late every day this is here." He taps the stone with 2 fingers, meaning now, meaning this precise instant, and you understand the correction is really about the half second you spent lying in the dark before rising, a half second he cannot possibly have witnessed, but somehow always seems to know about anyway. You take your place at the second case, the one with the smaller, more worn type, the letters polished nearly smooth, by thousands of hours of fingers exactly like yours, and you begin picking. Left hand holding the composing stick, right hand darting into the little wooden compartments, pulling out 1 letter at a time, setting it, spacing it, building a line of tomorrow's newspaper backward and upside down, because that is how type is read once it is locked into the form. A skill that took you the better part of a year to make automatic, and that your hand now performs faster than your eyes can consciously track. The type is cold. It has sat all night in an unheated shop, and the metal draws warmth out of your fingertips within minutes, leaving them stiff, slightly numb, clumsy in a way that makes the smallest letters, the commas, the periods, the tight little serifs of a lowercase as genuinely difficult to seat properly in the stick. By the second hour the shop has warmed enough from the pressroom fire that your fingers loosen, but by then the black has already worked its way in. It happens the same way every single day. You touch the type and a fine residue transfers from the metal to your skin, invisible at first, and then you touch your face to push hair out of your eyes, or you touch your mouth without thinking, and by mid-morning there is a faint grey smudge across your cheekbone that will still be there when you finally see a looking glass that evening, and you will not remember doing it. The lid itself is the least of what you handle. Twice a day you work fresh ink into the leather ink balls, kneading the black paste with your bare palms the way a baker kneads dough, except dough doesn't turn your skin black to the wrist and keep it that way for a week, no matter how hard you scrub with lye soap afterward. The soap is homemade, harsh, rendered from wood ash, an animal fat boiled down in an iron kettle out back, and it strips your skin raw without lifting more than a fraction of the stain, so that what you end up with by 13 is a permanent discoloration worked into the first 2 knuckles of both hands, a brand, visible from 30 feet, that marks you a printer's boy the same way a burn scar marks a blacksmith's boy, or a particular smell marks a tanner's. You have that smell too. Everyone in every trade does. You simply cannot smell your own, the way you cannot see the back of your own head. And it takes a stranger wrinkling his nose at you on the street, almost imperceptibly, to remind you that it exists at all. The privy is out back past the woodpile, a wooden box set over a pit that has not been moved or cleaned in longer than you have been apprenticed here. In summer, the stench drifts as far as the kitchen window, whenever the wind turns wrong, thick enough that your mother, when you still lived under her roof, used to burn dried herbs on the sill to cut it, though it never really worked, just added a sweetish smoke to the rot underneath. In winter you sit down on a seat so cold it burns through your breeches in the first second, and you do your business as fast as is physically possible, breath-fogging white in front of your face, using whatever is at hand afterward. A corncob kept in a basket by the door for exactly this purpose, a scrap of a ruined proof sheet, a handful of leaves in autumn if you're fortunate enough to find any still on the ground and not yet frozen solid. There is no such thing as paper made for this. There is no such thing either as privacy. The privy serves James's household, the other apprentices, and occasionally a customer who's asked to use it while waiting on an order, and you have learned simply not to look at anyone on your way in or out, because looking invites conversation, and conversation in that particular doorway is its own specific small humiliation. Nobody warns a boy about before he needs the warning. Inside, at night, it's a single chamber pot for the whole loft, and it fills fast with 4 boys packed into one room, and whoever empties it each morning is whoever lost the previous night's argument about whose turn it was. You lose more than your fair share of those arguments, mostly because the other 3 apprentices have been here longer, and have worked out an unspoken hierarchy that puts the newest boy at the bottom of it, carrying a full pot down 2 flights of stairs before dawn, trying not to slosh it against your leg, feeling the liquid weight pull unevenly at your wrist with every step, the faint warmth of it bleeding through the ceramic, even in the January cold. That is a specific unpleasantness that stays lodged in memory decades after the reason for remembering it has stopped mattering to anyone but you. You empty it into the gutter running down the centre of the street, alongside everyone else's, because Boston in 1718 has no sewers, only channels of filth the rain is meant to carry off, and mostly does not, so that by midsummer the whole street holds a low, sour reek that clings to your shoes and follows you the 6 blocks back to the shop. And you are expected, after all of this, the ink, the lead, the privy, the pot, to present yourself hands stained, hair unwashed, wearing a shirt that hasn't seen a wash tub in 3 weeks, and be told by your own brother that you look as though you've been dragged backward through a hedge, that no decent Boston family will trust their printing to a shop staffed by ragamuffins, and that you had better make yourself presentable before the Reverend Mather's assistant comes by to place an order for handbills. There is no water in the shop for washing except what sits in the bottom of the ink bucket, which is emphatically not for washing your face, no matter how tempting it looks on a hot morning, when the ink smell alone is enough to make your eyes water. So you go around back to the well, haul up a bucket with arms already aching from an hour of setting type, and splash cold water on your face and hands, working at the black stains with your thumbnail, getting perhaps half of it off before the cold makes your fingers too stiff to keep trying. Your shirt collar is grey. Your stockings have gone past grey into something closer to brown, the colour less a colour now than an accumulation. You own 2 shirts total, and washing day comes once a week if you're fortunate, once every 2 weeks if the household laundress is behind on other work, which she usually is, because she is one woman doing the wash for an entire household of boys who all seem to conspire without meaning to generate filth faster than she can remove it. This is the world you live in for 9 years. It does not get better. In some ways, it gets worse, because as you grow older, you become more aware of what you smell like, more aware of the lice. Let's talk about the lice, because everyone in 1718 Boston has them, and nobody discusses it in polite company, but you live with 3 other apprentices in one bed-crowded room, and you will have them too, sooner rather than later. The first time you feel that crawling itch at the base of your skull, you assume it's only sweat, only the closeness of a summer night in a room with no window that opens properly. Then scratching, you catch one between 2 fingers, a tiny pale brown thing, fast, slippery, impossible to crush cleanly on the first try, and you understand. Getting rid of them means a fine-toothed comb dragged through your hair for 20 minutes at a stretch, picking eggs, the nits one by one from strands close to the scalp, your scalp raw and stinging afterward from teeth-scraping skin you didn't know was so tender. It never fully works. There is always another boy in the room who has them too, and lice do not respect whose bed is whose. Once the candle is out and everyone is packed together for warmth against a New England winter that does not care how crowded you are, only that you are cold. You start, quietly, without telling anyone, without entirely understanding why, to care more about all of this than a boy in your position is supposed to care. The other apprentices don't seem bothered. James certainly isn't. Your parents, back when you lived under their roof, weren't especially bothered either, beyond the ordinary insistence that a body be decently covered and a face be reasonably clean for the Sabbath meeting house. But something in you rebels quietly against the general filth of your existence, and it isn't virtue exactly, not yet. It's something closer to disgust, a fastidiousness with no outlet and no permission in this house, and so you swallow it, the way you swallow the lead dust, a little more every day, and keep setting type with black hands and a lice-bitten scalp and a body that has not been properly washed all over in longer than you can remember, and you tell yourself this is simply what it means to be a printer's boy, in this city, in this century, and there is nothing to be done about it. You are wrong about that. It will take years, an ocean crossing, a near drowning, a dead son, and an old age spent half naked in front of open windows before you prove yourself wrong. But that is later. Right now, at 12, at 13, at 15, you simply live in it, the way everyone lives in it, and the itching becomes background noise, the way the smell of your own body becomes something you stop noticing, except when a gust of wind carries it back to you unexpectedly, and you flinch, briefly, at what you've become used to. It isn't only the loft that's filthy. Boston itself, beyond the shop's four walls, is a city that treats dirt as simply the cost of living close together, and you learn its particular textures on every errand James sends you running. The market near the town dock is a chaos of mud and offal by mid-morning, fish guts flung from the stalls where the day's catch is being cleaned, gulls fighting over the scraps with a shrieking that never entirely stops, and the cobbles underfoot are slick with something you've learned not to look at too closely. A paste of trampled vegetable rinds and animal blood and horse dung ground, fine by cartwheels, so that by the time you've delivered a bundle of handbills to 3 shops and doubled back, your stockings are soaked through to the ankle with a wet that smells nothing like rain. The gutters running down the centre of every street carry whatever households pour into them, and on a hot August afternoon the whole town seems to exhale at once, a low reek rising off the channels that you taste at the back of your throat more than you smell it, thick enough to make you breathe through your mouth for entire blocks at a stretch. Hogs root freely through the refuse piled at the mouths of certain alleys, half-feral animals that the town tolerates because they do more to clear the garbage than any ordinance has managed. And you've learned to give them a wide berth after one nearly took your hand off going for a scrap of bread you were carrying, its jaw snapping shut an inch from your fingers with a wet, heavy sound that stayed with you for days. The wharves smell of tar and brine, and the particular sourness of fish left too long in the sun before being salted. And beneath all of it, at low tide, the exposed mudflats along the harbour's edge give off a stench of their own, a rotten egg sulphur smell mixed with dead shellfish that clings to your clothes if you linger there even a few minutes, which is precisely where you go to swim, because it's the only stretch of water close enough to reach on the half-hour James occasionally allows you between errands. The first real crack in that resignation comes from that water, of all things, and it happens almost by accident, the way the important things usually seem to. You had learned to swim as a small boy, self-taught really, the way most Boston boys near the harbour were, thrashing in the shallows of the mill pond until you worked out how to keep your head up and your arms moving without sinking. But somewhere around 15, cooped up in that shop with the ink and the lead, and the sour, close air of 4 boys sleeping in one loft, swimming stops being a game and starts being the only thing that makes you feel clean. Not soap clean. Something else. Something closer to relief. An entirely different category of sensation from anything a basin has ever given you. You slip away on Sunday afternoons when you can manage it, down toward the water, and you strip off that grey shirt and those brown stockings and wade in, and the shock of the cold hits your chest like a slap, driving the breath out of you in a single gasp, and then you're moving, arms cutting through water that's murky and cold and tastes faintly of salt and rot when it splashes into your mouth. And for the first time in a week you cannot smell the ink or the lead or the privy or your own unwashed skin because the water has taken all of it, scoured you in a way no basin ever could. You come out shivering, gooseflesh climbing your arms, water sheeting off you and pooling at your bare feet on the rocks, and you feel for a few hours until the sweat and the ink build back up, genuinely, thoroughly clean. And you do not yet have a word for how much you crave that feeling, or how strange it is that a body should crave cleanliness the way a stomach craves bread. You get good at it. Better than good. Boys who know you start saying you swim like you were born half fish, and you take a private, unshowy pride in that. The same quiet pride you take in a well-set page. a competence nobody forced on you, something entirely yours in a life where almost nothing else is. You teach yourself new strokes. Watch how your arms cut the water with less splash if you angle them just so. How your legs drive you faster if you kick from the hip instead of the knee. And once, on a dare, you fasten 2 wooden paddles you've whittled yourself to your hands, another pair strapped flat to your feet, and let a kite's pull drag you across the pond on your back, laughing, swallowing water, half terrified and wholly delighted, your body doing something no properly raised boy's body is supposed to be doing in public on a Sunday. The other apprentices at James's shop find your enthusiasm for the water faintly ridiculous. One of them asking outright one Sunday why you'd bother wading into water so cold, your lips go faintly blue by the time you climb out, when a body could simply stay dry and warm and spare itself the trouble entirely. You don't have a good answer for him at 15 beyond the plain fact that it feels good, that something in your chest loosens the moment the water closes over your shoulders, that nothing on dry land has ever managed to loosen. Not sleep, not food, not the rare stretch of an afternoon with no errands pending. He shrugs, unconvinced, and goes back to skipping stones from the bank while you swim out past where he's willing to follow. There is one afternoon, though, that nearly ends differently, and it happens on a day when the harbour current is stronger than you've accounted for, pulling harder than the mill pond ever did, and you go out further than you mean to because the water feels so good after a week that smelled of ink and tallow that you simply forget for a stretch of minutes to keep track of the shore. The cold starts to work into your limbs in a way that's different from the usual bracing shock. A deeper, more patient cold, one that slows your arms before you notice it happening. And when you finally do notice, when you turn to look back at the rocks you started from, they are further away than they have any right to be, and the current is still pulling, steady, indifferent, not violent but relentless. And for a handful of seconds that feel much longer than they are, your chest tightens with something that isn't cold at all. You force your arms to move properly, angling not straight for the shore but along the current's pull, the way you've watched older watermen do it, cutting across instead of fighting head-on, and your lungs burn and your legs cramp once, sharply, in the calf, a knot of pain that nearly doubles you under the surface, and you claw through it, through the cramp, through the cold, until your knees finally scrape gravel, and you crawl the last few feet on hands and knees, coughing up a mouthful of harbour water, shaking so hard your teeth clatter audibly. You sit there a long while afterward, alone, wrapped in nothing but your own arms, before you trust your legs enough to stand. You never tell James. You go back into the water within the fortnight anyway, more carefully this time, because by then you already understand something most people around you never will, that the thing which nearly killed you is also the only thing that has ever made you feel properly clean, and you're not willing to give it up simply because it frightened you once. This matters more than it sounds like it should. In a life about to be crowded with soot and lead, and unwashed lodging houses on 2 continents, swimming is the first thing that teaches your body. Not your mind, your body. That being clean is not a luxury reserved for the wealthy, or a superstition indulged by the fearful. It is a physical pleasure, as real and as urgent as being warm or being fed. And once your body has learned that lesson in cold Boston water, it does not unlearn it, no matter how many years pass before you're able to properly act on it again. But you're getting ahead of yourself, and the shop is calling, and a fight with James is brewing that will change the entire direction of your life. So let's stay in the filth a little longer, because it gets worse before it gets better. At 17, you run. Not far at first, just to Philadelphia, but it might as well be the moon, because you arrive with almost nothing. $1 and a shilling's worth of coppers in your pocket, the clothes on your back, no letters of introduction, nobody in the entire city who knows your name. You've slept 2 nights aboard a boat, and before that tramped 50 miles on foot from New York after failing to find work there, and by the time you walk up Market Street on that October morning, you are, by your own later account, about as disreputable looking a figure as the city has seen in some time. Your pockets are stuffed with dirty shirts and stockings because you have nowhere else to put them. Your clothes are filthy and wrinkled from the crossing. You buy 3 big rolls of bread because you don't yet know Philadelphia prices and end up with far more than you can eat, and you walk up the street gnawing on one loaf, a roll tucked under each arm, and a young woman standing in a doorway, a woman who will one day be your wife, looks at you and thinks, quite reasonably, that you are the most ridiculous, awkward-looking figure she has ever laid eyes on. That image sticks with you your whole life, and it should, because it's true in a way that goes deeper than the bread rolls. You are, at 17, a boy who has never once had the resources or the permission to simply be clean. Every filthy thing that has happened to your body up to this point, the lead dust, the ink stains, the lice, the unwashed shirts worn for weeks at a stretch, the chamber pots, the privies, the smell you can no longer detect on yourself because you've lived inside it for so long, walks up Market Street with you, invisible but entirely present, and the girl in the doorway can practically smell it from 10 feet away, even if she's too polite to say so out loud. You find work with a printer named Keimer, and here the filth takes on a new dimension entirely, because Keimer's shop, unlike your brother's, is not merely dirty in the ordinary printer's way. Old ink, old lead, unwashed workers. It is dirty because Keimer himself is one of the strangest, most disorganized men you'll ever labour for. A fellow who half preaches invented religious doctrines while running a shop with barely any proper equipment, so that jobs stack up undone, deadlines blow past, and you find yourself sleeping for a stretch. In a back room that smells of mouse droppings and damp plaster, on a pallet that goes damp itself half the time from a leak in the roof nobody has bothered to patch. You lie there some nights listening to a slow drip somewhere above your head, counting the seconds between drops the way you once counted seconds underwater, and you think, not for the first time, that you have traded one kind of grime for another and gained very little in the exchange. Your lodgings for a while are with a family named Reed, the very family whose doorway you walked past with your bread rolls. And while they're kinder than Keimer, the house itself is an ordinary Philadelphia row house of the period, meaning no running water, a privy shared between multiple households up and down the alley, a kitchen fire that smokes when the wind comes from the wrong direction, and fills the whole ground floor with a haze that stings your eyes and coats the back of your throat until you're coughing along with everyone else at the supper table, nobody remarking on it because everybody's used to it. There's a specific Sunday morning that stays with you, months into your time at Keimer's, when Deborah Reed, not yet your wife, still just the neighbour's daughter who watched you eat bread rolls in the street, happens to be sweeping the front step as you come out to fetch water, and she looks at your shirt, which you have been wearing for 11 days straight because the household wash has fallen behind again, and she says nothing directly, but there's a particular set to her mouth, a small controlled wince quickly smoothed over, that tells you everything her politeness won't let her say. You go back inside, and for the first time since arriving in Philadelphia, you scrub that shirt yourself in a basin of cold water with a stub of harsh soap. kneeling on the kitchen floor working the fabric between your knuckles until your hands ache and the water in the basin has gone the colour of weak tea, and you hang it to dry over the back of a chair near the smoking fire, and you tell no one why you've suddenly taken an interest in laundry. The physical labour of the printing trade itself does not spare you, regardless of how much you scrub. Keimer's shop, when there's work at all, demands the same 12 and 14-hour days you knew in Boston, and by the end of one, your forearms ache from working the press bar. A repeated pulling motion that, done 1,000 times over a shift, leaves a deep, specific soreness low across your shoulders that no amount of stretching entirely relieves until the following morning gives you a fresh set of muscles to abuse. The shop itself, once you and Meredith finally scrape together enough credit to open your own establishment rather than working for Keimer's wages, is a narrow space on Market Street, barely wide enough for the press and the two composing frames set against opposite walls, with a low ceiling that traps the smell of ink and hot metal so thoroughly that visitors sometimes pause in the doorway, faces briefly startled, before stepping fully inside. You keep it swept more often than strictly necessary, a habit that costs you a few minutes each evening you could otherwise spend on paying work, and Meredith teases you about it more than once, asking whether you mean to make the place fit for a duchess to visit, and you tell him, only half joking, that a clean shop sells better than a dirty one, which is true enough as a business argument even though it isn't really the whole of your reasoning. Your palms callous over within weeks, the skin at the base of each finger thickening into hard yellowed pads that catch and snag on fine linen when you're not careful, and there's a particular ache that settles into your hands by the 4th or 5th hour of setting type, a cramping tightness across the base of your thumb that you learn to work out by flexing your fingers wide, again and again between lines, a habit that stays with you decades after you've stopped setting type for a living, your hand flexing unconsciously whenever you sit too long at a writing desk. There's a specific customer, early in your time working for yourself once you've finally scraped together the partnership that lets you open your own shop with a man named Meredith, who stops by to order a set of visiting cards and looks you over with an expression you recognise instantly, having seen it on Deborah Reed's face and on 100 other faces since. A fine Philadelphia matron in good silk, glancing at your ink-stained apron, your rolled sleeves, the black permanently worked into your knuckles, and saying, with the particular delicate cruelty of someone who believes she's being merely observant rather than unkind, that she supposes a printer's hands can never really be got clean, can they? The way a farmer's never truly loses the smell of his fields. You tell her evenly that you find a good scrub gets most of it, and she smiles in a way that makes clear she doesn't believe you, and orders her cards anyway because your prices are fair and your work is good, and you finish the transaction with the same steady courtesy you'd show any customer, and only later, alone, closing up the shop for the night, do you let yourself feel the small, familiar sting of it. A sting you've felt in one form or another since a girl in a doorway watched you eat bread rolls off the street and thought you a ridiculous figure, and that you have still, even now, not entirely stopped feeling, no matter how much the shop prospers. Years later, once the printing business has grown enough that you're also serving as deputy postmaster for the colonies, the road itself becomes a regular part of your life, and colonial travel turns out to be its own particular education in filth. Different again from the shop, the ship, the tavern, the coaching inns that dot the post roads between Philadelphia and Boston, Philadelphia and New York, vary wildly in quality, and you learn quickly which ones to avoid, though avoiding them isn't always possible when darkness or weather forces a stop regardless of preference. A bad inn means a shared room with strangers, exactly as in London, except now the strangers are also caked in the mud and horse sweat of a full day's ride, their boots left steaming by whatever fire is available, the whole room filling with a damp animal reek of wet wool and unwashed men that settles into the very plaster of the walls after enough seasons of housing traveller after traveller with nowhere better to put them. The beds, when there are enough to go around, are shared 2 and sometimes 3 to a mattress, and you've slept beside snoring strangers whose boots you can smell from across the room, whose last bath was clearly weeks if not months in the past, and you lie there in the dark running through your own mental ledger. Another mark, surely, in whatever column exists for nights you failed to control the conditions of your own cleanliness, before finally giving up and sleeping anyway, because a body that has spent all day jolting over rutted roads in a swaying coach does not stay awake out of mere fastidiousness. The road dust itself is its own trial, a fine grey powder kicked up by hooves and wheels that coats every inch of exposed skin within an hour of travel, working its way into your collar, your cuffs, the creases at the corners of your eyes, so that by the time you arrive anywhere you look, by your own wry description in a letter home, as though you'd been dredged rather than driven. You take to carrying a small flask of water and a cloth specifically for wiping your face and hands at each stop where the horses are changed, a habit the other passengers find mildly amusing. One gentleman remarking once, watching you carefully work grit from beneath your fingernails at a way station while everyone else simply stamps the dust off their boots and calls it good enough, that you're a fussier traveller than any lady he's ever escorted. You take no offence at the remark. You've been called worse by better company for the exact same habit since you were 12 years old scrubbing at ink stains with a thumbnail at a Boston well, and you've long since stopped expecting anyone to fully understand why it matters to you as much as it does. Then London happens, and if you thought colonial filth was bad, London in 1724 teaches you an entirely new vocabulary of disgusting. You cross the Atlantic at 18, expecting letters of credit and a commission to buy printing equipment that never materialises, deceived by a colonial governor who promised far more than he could deliver, and you land in London with almost nothing again, forced to find work at a print shop simply to survive. London's print shops, you discover almost immediately, run on beer, not water, not tea, not anything remotely resembling temperance. Beer, gallons of it, consumed by the workmen from before dawn until well after dark, because the prevailing belief among London pressmen is that strong beer gives a man the strength for the heavy physical labour of running a press, pulling the bar again and again for 12 or 14 hours, hauling reams of wet paper, hefting the heavy iron frame of the press itself, a frame that takes 2 men straining together just to shift a few inches when it needs adjusting. You do not drink beer at breakfast. You drink water, which every single man in that shop finds bizarre, faintly suspicious, possibly effeminate, and they call you the water American behind your back and sometimes to your face, and they mock you for your strange abstemious ways even as your body proves, over the following weeks, that you can outlift and outwork every one of them despite their gallons of strong beer, simply because you're not perpetually half drunk and sluggish by mid-afternoon, the way most of them are by the second hour after their noon meal. But here is the filth. Those men soaked in beer sweat labouring in the heat of the press room do not wash. Nobody washes. London in the 1720s has essentially no public bathing culture for working men. Bathing is for the wealthy, in private tubs with servants to haul the water, and even then it's considered mildly suspect, a French affectation, something that opens the body to chill and fever the way everyone from your own brother James to these London pressmen still half believes. The press room you work in is a stew of beer sweat and unwashed wool, and the ever-present reek of ink and lead, layered on top of a city that itself smells, at street level, of coal smoke so thick it blackens every building within a decade, of the Thames at low tide releasing a stench that can turn your stomach from 4 streets away, of horse dung ground into every cobblestone, of tanneries and slaughterhouses whose runoff drains eventually into that same black river you'll soon be swimming in for pleasure. There's a fellow pressman named Wygate, a bit better educated than the rest, who takes an interest in you early on, partly because you're the only man in the shop who reads anything beyond a tavern bill, and it's Wygate who first asks you, half in jest, whether the rumour is true that you swam in Boston Harbour for sport. For sport and for something else, you tell him. Feels like the only hour of the week I'm properly clean. He looks at you the way the pressmen look at your water drinking. Half amused, half suspicious, entirely unconvinced. You'll take a chill and die of it, he says, which is precisely what everyone has been telling you your whole life, and which you have, by now, stopped believing. It's Wygate, in the end, who's standing beside you on the bank the day the wealthy gentleman makes his offer about the swimming school, and he watches your face carefully while you consider it, watches you turn the idea over, the way he's watched you turn over a difficult line of type, weighing it from every angle before committing it to the stick. You could be somebody, teaching Lord's sons to swim, he says. Better coin than pressing paper, certainly. You tell him you're not sure that's true, not in any way that matters beyond the coin itself, and he asks what you mean, and you find yourself explaining, somewhat to your own surprise, that swimming has never felt to you like something to sell, that it feels instead like the one part of your life nobody assigned you and nobody can take away, and that teaching it as a paid amusement for gentlemen who'll forget the lesson within a season feels, when you actually sit with the idea, like handing over the one clean thing you own. Wygate doesn't entirely follow the reasoning, tells you plainly you're a strange one, Franklin, always were, but he doesn't argue further, and a few weeks later you're aboard a ship bound back across the Atlantic, the swimming school offer left behind unclaimed, the decision made less by calculation than by the same stubborn instinct that's guided most of your choices about your own body, your entire life. Your lodgings are a garret room shared with strangers, the mattress lumpy with vermin. You learn to simply stop noticing. The chamber pot emptied out the window into the street below. The old warning cry of Gardyloo shouted down before the contents are flung, though half the time nobody bothers to shout it. And you learn to walk close to the buildings, away from the overhanging eaves, because more than once something wet and foul-smelling splatters the cobbles just behind your heels, close enough that you feel a fine mist of it on the back of your stockings. The room itself holds 4 beds crammed close enough that you could reach out and touch the man beside you without fully extending your arm, and the air by midnight is thick with the combined breath and sweat of 4 grown men who have each spent 12 hours in a beer-soaked press room, and none of whom own more than 2 shirts. One of your roommates, an older compositor named Potter, snores with a wet, rattling wheeze that you eventually learn to sleep through only by sheer exhaustion, and another, a younger apprentice barely 15 who's clearly homesick and says so at length most nights, until someone throws a boot at him to shut him up, cries quietly enough most nights that you pretend not to hear it, because you remember being that age yourself and understand there's no kindness in acknowledging it out loud. The window, such as it is, does not open, sealed shut by decades of paint and warped wood, so the only ventilation the room gets is whatever slips under the ill-fitting door, and by August the heat and stink pool at ceiling height until you can practically see it. A visible haze in the single candle's light before someone finally blows the candle out, and the darkness at least spares you having to look at it. You wash, when you wash at all, from a shared basin at the bottom of the stairs, water hauled from a public pump 2 streets over by whichever lodger drew the short straw that week, and the basin is used by every tenant in the building before it's emptied and refilled, so that by the time your turn comes the water has already gone cloudy and faintly grey, carrying a film on its surface you try not to think about as you splash it onto your face. Your landlady, a widow named Mrs. Nixon, who runs the lodging house with a sharp tongue and sharper eye for unpaid rent, cares nothing for whether her tenants bathe, only that they pay on time and don't burn the building down with an unattended candle, and when you ask her early on whether there's somewhere nearby a man might get a proper hot bath, she looks at you as though you've asked where a man might purchase a unicorn and says, not unkindly, that gentlemen do that sort of thing, not printers' men, and you'd best save your coin for supper. London at night, once the shop's shuttered and the last customer's gone, is its own separate education, and you walk it more than you probably should for a boy your age with almost no money to protect himself if something goes wrong. There are no street lamps worth the name in most quarters, just the occasional oil lamp guttering weakly outside a tavern door, and the alleys between are black enough that you learn to navigate half by memory and half by sound. The particular echo of your own footsteps off a close brick wall, the distant clatter of a cart still working late, a woman's laugh from an upstairs window that tells you which house is which even when you can't see the sign. You pass more than once the doorways of houses everyone in the print shop refers to obliquely, never quite by their plain name, and you understand well enough what happens inside them, and you understand too because Wygate makes a point of telling you plainly one evening, half as warning and half as the kind of crude joke pressmen trade to fill a slow hour, that a man who visits those houses carelessly can come away with something considerably worse than an empty purse, a private, creeping rot that doesn't show itself for weeks and then never fully leaves a man once it's taken hold, disfiguring in ways whispered about more than described outright. You keep your distance, not entirely out of virtue if you're honest with yourself, but out of the same careful, almost superstitious caution you bring to everything involving your own body since Boston Harbour nearly took you under. A sense, not fully reasoned, that your body is the one thing in this filthy, indifferent city that still belongs entirely to you, and you're not eager to gamble it away in a dark doorway for an hour's diversion. The tavern where the pressmen drink after their shift, and sometimes before it, and sometimes for a few of them straight through it, is called the Bell, a low-ceilinged room thick with tobacco smoke and the yeasty reek of spilled ale gone sour in the floorboards over years of nobody ever properly scrubbing them. You go there some evenings, not to drink much yourself, but because refusing entirely marks you as strange in a way you can't always afford, and you nurse a single small beer for 2 hours while Wygate and the others work steadily through pot after pot, growing louder, more argumentous, more prone to grabbing at the tavern girls in ways that make you wince, and that the girls themselves have clearly long since learned to deflect with practised, weary skill. The floor rushes underfoot are changed rarely enough that walking across the room means walking across a slick paste of old ale, tobacco spit, and things you'd rather not identify, and more than once you watch a man slip in it entirely, going down hard enough to rattle the whole table, to general laughter, himself laughing hardest of anyone once he's confirmed nothing's broken. And yet, and this is the part that starts slowly to change you, London is also, unexpectedly, where you discover something like a swimming culture, and you throw yourself into it with an enthusiasm that startles the pressman even more than your water drinking does. You swim in the Thames itself, which by any modern standard is an act of near suicidal recklessness, given what's dumped into that river daily, but which, in 1724, several London gentlemen and apprentices do regularly for exercise and pleasure, wading in below Chelsea where the current runs slower and the banks are less crowded with wharves. You become known, within weeks, as one of the finest swimmers in the city, and you swim the long stretch from Chelsea to Blackfriars, several miles, performing tricks along the way, diving, floating motionless on your back with your arms crossed over your chest like a corpse laid out for burial, rolling and somersaulting beneath the surface, while a small crowd of onlookers gathered on a pleasure boat watches in genuine astonishment, calling out to one another, pointing, one of them eventually leaning over the rail to ask, half in wonder, how long you can hold your breath below. Afterward, dripping on the bank, wringing river water from your shirt with hands that shake slightly from exertion and cold, exhilarated in a way the pressroom never leaves you, a wealthy acquaintance offers to pay for you to set up a proper swimming school for gentlemen, to travel Europe teaching young English aristocrats to swim, and offer you seriously entertain for several weeks before deciding, in the end, to go home to Philadelphia instead. The voyage home is its own particular trial, 18 months after you'd first crossed with such high hopes and so little money, and the ship you take back is crowded, slow, and, for one stretch of 9 days, caught in weather bad enough that you genuinely doubt you'll see land again. Below decks, where you and most of the other passengers shelter from the worst of it, the air turns thick and sour within the first day of rough seas, dozens of bodies packed into a space with almost no ventilation, most of them seasick, the deck beneath you awash in a mixture of bilge water and vomit that sloshes from one side of the hull to the other, with each roll of the ship so that you learn to brace your feet and hold on to whatever's nearest whenever a particularly hard swell hits. Because losing your footing means going down into that slurry, and you've seen it happen to men twice your size. You yourself are sick for the first 2 days, retching over a bucket that's never quite empty enough, your stomach cramping long after there's anything left to bring up, and by the 3rd day you've learned the specific miserable rhythm of surviving a storm at sea. Sip water when you can keep it down, sleep in whatever brief lull the ship's pitching allows, and try not to think too hard about the smell, which by that point in the crossing has become so total, so inescapable, that you stop registering it as smell at all, and start experiencing it instead as a kind of pressure behind your eyes. A constant low throb that only truly lifts once you're standing on solid ground again in Philadelphia, breathing air that, filthy as it is by any reasonable standard, feels by comparison like the cleanest thing you've ever tasted. Think about what that means. In a city, in a century, where regular bathing is viewed with suspicion, where the working men around you go weeks between washing anything but their hands and faces, you have found, through nothing more complicated than the pleasure of cold water against skin, your own private, unfashionable, deeply eccentric relationship with cleanliness. It isn't virtue yet, it's appetite. But appetite in you has a way of eventually becoming doctrine. You return to Philadelphia at 20, and the filth of your circumstances doesn't vanish. You're still poor, still scraping by, still living in rented rooms with imperfect washing arrangements, still running toward a print shop of your own where ink and lead will cake your hands black exactly as they always have. But something has shifted inside you, and it shows up a few years later in a document nobody expects a jobbing printer to write. A list of 13 virtues you intend to master, one at a time, methodically, the way you'd typeset a page, checking your progress daily in a little book ruled into columns for each day of the week. Temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation. And there, sitting matter-of-factly among virtues that sound properly moral and improving, one that startles most people who read the list for the first time because it doesn't sound like a virtue at all, it sounds like a chore. Cleanliness. Tolerate no uncleanliness in body, clothes, or habitation. By now you've married Deborah, the same young woman who watched you eat bread rolls in the street all those years ago, who married you eventually in a common law arrangement after her first husband disappeared and left the legalities too tangled for a proper church wedding, and who runs your household with a brisk competence that includes, to your quiet relief, an actual standard for household laundering that neither Boston nor Keimer's shop nor your London lodgings ever managed to maintain. Deborah keeps a wash day every week without fail, and there is something almost luxurious, after a decade of 2 shirts and a fortnight's wait, in simply having clean linen laid out for you on a regular schedule, in not having to calculate each morning how many more days a collar can be stretched before it becomes an embarrassment. She teases you sometimes about how particular you've become, about the extra basin you insist on keeping filled in your own chamber, about the frequency with which you send shirts to the wash compared to other husbands on the street, about the morning ritual at the open window that she's long since stopped trying to talk you out of. But she indulges it without much real complaint, because she's also the one who benefits from a husband who doesn't track ink and lead dust through the front hall the way he once tracked it through every boarding house he ever lived in. You keep that little book in a coat pocket, the pages soft at the corners from handling, and every evening by candlelight you sit at the same small table where you eat your solitary supper, and you go down the list of 13, 1 virtue per week in rotation, and you mark a small black dot in the appropriate column for any day you feel you've fallen short. The first week you devote fully to cleanliness, you are startled, almost embarrassed, by how many dots accumulate. Monday, a dot, because you wore the same stockings a second day running. Wednesday, a dot because you didn't trouble to wash your hands before the midday meal, too rushed between customers to bother with a well out back. Friday, 2 dots. Once for a shirt collar you knew was foul when you put it on, and once for letting the print shop floor go 3 days without sweeping, ink dust and paper scraps building up in the corners until a customer's hem dragged through it and left a black smear across her petticoat, and she said nothing. But you saw her notice, and the noticing itself felt like a verdict. You show the book to almost no one. Bunce, a friend from the reading club you've started, a group of tradesmen and clerks who meet on Friday evenings to argue philosophy and improve one another's minds, a club you've named, with the plain directness that will mark most of your naming choices for the rest of your life. Simply the Junto, catches sight of a page over your shoulder and laughs, not unkindly, at the idea of a grown man keeping a ledger of his own dirty shirts, the way another man might keep accounts of debts owed. You track your sins the way you'd track a customer's balance, he says. A debt's a debt, you tell him, and you mean it more seriously than the joke deserves. I'd rather know exactly how much I owe than guess and be wrong. You show him one page briefly, the columns ruled with a straight edge in your own careful hand, the black dots scattered unevenly across the week, heavier in the cleanliness column than in most of the others, which surprises him, because he's known you 2 years now as a man who always seems freshly washed, collar crisp, hands scrubbed pink before any meeting. And he says as much, genuinely puzzled that the tally doesn't match the man sitting across from him. You tell him the tally isn't measuring what he thinks it's measuring, that a clean collar on a Friday evening says nothing about whether you managed a proper wash on Tuesday, or whether Wednesday's shirt went a full extra day past when it should have been changed because the shop was too busy to spare the time, and that the book exists precisely to catch the gap between how a man appears in company and how he's actually managed his own body when nobody's looking. He considers this for a moment, turns his own cup of coffee slowly on the tabletop, and admits he's never once thought to hold himself to a standard nobody else could see or judge him by. Neither had you tell him, until you'd spent long enough being judged for things you couldn't help that you decided the only judgment worth trusting was the one you kept for yourself, in a little book in your own hand where nobody's opinion but your own could inflate or excuse the score. He doesn't entirely understand, and you don't entirely expect him to, because the ledger isn't really about morality in the way the other 12 virtues are: silence, order, frugality. These are matters of character that any Puritan household would recognize and approve. Cleanliness sits differently. It's a private accounting of a debt incurred years earlier, in a Boston loft with 3 other boys and 1 chamber pot, in a body that spent 9 years steeped in lead dust and lice, and the smell of its own neglect, and you are, dot by dot, week by week, trying to pay that debt back to yourself, in a currency nobody around you quite recognizes as legitimate. That private ledger, oddly enough, doesn't stay private for long, because the same appetite that drives you to track your own dirty shirts in a little book eventually turns outward, onto the streets of the city itself, and the junto becomes the place where that shift happens. You raise the question, one Friday evening, between a debate on natural philosophy and a dispute over a proposed subscription library, almost as an aside, whether the club oughtn't to concern itself with the state of the streets themselves, given how much mud and refuse a man tracks into his own house simply by walking to market. A few of the members laugh, assuming you're making conversation rather than proposing anything serious, but you are in fact dead serious, in the particular way you are always dead serious under a light joking surface. And within a few years that offhand remark has become a formal proposal, circulated, argued over, eventually adopted, a scheme to hire a man with a horse and cart to sweep the market streets twice a week, funded by a small subscription from the shopkeepers whose goods and floors and customers' hems suffer most directly from the mud. You walk the market streets yourself more than once in the weeks before drafting the proposal, simply to observe rather than to shop, noting exactly where the mud pools deepest, exactly which stalls generate the worst of the refuse by mid-afternoon, and there's a specific morning when you stand at the corner nearest the courthouse and watch a well-dressed woman lift her skirts to cross a stretch of street so thoroughly churned to muck by cart traffic that even lifted, the hem still drags through the worst of it, leaving a dark stain she'll only discover once she's home and it's too late to do anything but scrub. You think of Deborah's wash day, of the hours that stain will cost some servant somewhere in the city, hours that a swept street could have spared entirely, and it's that image, more than any abstract civic principle, that you carry back to your writing desk that evening, You write the proposal yourself, laying out the economics of it with the same care you'd bring to a printing contract. So many shillings a week from so many subscribers, weighed against the value of clean floors and dry goods not ruined by tracked filth, and you make the case, plainly, that a clean street is not a luxury but a kind of shared property. The way a well-swept shop floor is worth more to a merchant than a filthy one, even if the sweeping itself produces nothing anyone can sell. Years later this grows into something larger still, into paved streets, into proper drainage, into an ordinance requiring householders to sweep the pavement in front of their own doors before 9 each morning, and into a night soil removal system meant to get the contents of the city's privies and chamber pots out of the open gutters and into carts that haul it beyond the town's edge, instead of leaving it to rot in the channels the way it always rotted in Boston. You are, by the time you're a man in your 40s, not merely tracking your own cleanliness in a private book anymore. You are trying, quietly, methodically, one subscription and one ordinance at a time, to drag an entire city a few degrees closer to the standard you once could not meet for yourself as a boy with 2 shirts and a lice-ridden scalp. And there is something in that work that feels, to you, less like civic duty and more like an old debt being repaid on a much larger ledger than the one in your coat pocket. A public hospital is another project you help drive into existence around this same stretch of your life. Worked out over long evenings with a physician friend, Dr. Bond, who complains to you that the sick poor of Philadelphia have nowhere at all to go for proper care beyond whatever a crowded, unsanitary household can offer them, and the two of you spend months petitioning the Assembly, arguing the case in the pages of your own newspaper, structuring the funding as a matching scheme where private subscriptions are doubled by public money. Piece of financial engineering you're rather proud of even decades later. When the hospital finally opens its doors, you walk through the wards yourself more than once, and what strikes you most beyond the beds and the physicians and the general relief of patients who'd otherwise have been left in filthy back rooms with no care at all, is how deliberately clean the place is kept compared to anywhere else you've spent time in your life. Floors scrubbed daily, linens changed with a regularity that would have seemed miraculous to the boy who once waited 2 weeks between wash days, windows left open to air out rooms the way you've always privately believed rooms ought to be aired, whether or not the attending physicians would agree with your reasoning if you explained it to them outright. You don't say much about it at the time, beyond the practical business of fundraising and administration, but there's a private satisfaction in it you don't share with anyone. The sense that some sliver of the standard you've spent your whole adult life quietly trying to build for yourself has now been built, permanently, in brick and linen, for strangers who will never know your name, let alone the Boston loft or the London garret that taught you why it mattered. The volunteer fire company you help organise around this same period puts you in direct, physical contact with a different kind of filth entirely, and it's honest work in a way the street sweeping subscription never quite is, because a fire doesn't care how carefully you've dressed for the evening. You've been called out more than once straight from a Junto meeting, coat abandoned somewhere behind you, sleeves already rolled, joining the bucket line that snakes from the nearest well or cistern to whatever building is burning, and the work is brutal in the plainest possible way. A full bucket weighs more than you expect every single time, water sloshing over the rim to soak your shirt and breeches within the first several passes, your shoulders and forearms burning within minutes from the repeated strain of receiving a bucket, swinging it forward, passing it on, over and over, a rhythm that has to hold steady for however long the fire takes to master, sometimes an hour, sometimes most of a night. Ash and soot settle over everyone working the line, fine and black and clinging, mixing with sweat until your face is streaked grey-black by the time the flames are finally beaten down to smoking ruin, and your throat is raw from smoke, your eyes stinging and watering so badly you can barely see the man next to you. And afterward, walking home in the small hours, filthy in a way that has nothing shameful about it at all, nothing like the quiet, ink-stained shame of your apprentice years you feel, oddly, closer to clean than you have in weeks, because this dirt, at least, was earned doing something that mattered, and there is a basin waiting for you at home with your name essentially written on it, and nobody in your household will so much as blink at how black the water turns once you've finally washed the soot away. Then, in the year 1736, your son Francis dies, 4 years old, of smallpox, and the entire architecture of your relationship to cleanliness and disease gets rebuilt from the ground up in the worst possible way. You had not had him inoculated. Inoculation against smallpox exists by this point, a crude, dangerous procedure where a physician deliberately infects a healthy person with material drawn from a smallpox pustule, hoping to induce a mild case that confers lasting immunity rather than a severe case that kills, but it is controversial, feared, argued over in every newspaper, including your own, and you had held off, telling yourself you would do it when Francis was a little older, a little stronger, when the timing was better. He caught the disease naturally instead, the ordinary way, breathing it in from someone in the crowded, densely packed, imperfectly washed streets of Philadelphia, where smallpox moves through unwashed populations the way fire moves through dry grass in a drought. The sick room itself takes on a smell within the first 2 days that you will recognize faintly for the rest of your life whenever you encounter something close to it. A sweetish, close, slightly metallic odour that seems to rise from the pustules themselves, mixed with the ordinary sourness of a small body sweating through fever night after night without proper washing, because moving him to bathe him is too dangerous, too likely to chill a system already fighting for its life, so you're left instead sponging him gently with a barely damp cloth, careful of every raised mark on his skin, the cloth itself needing to be rinsed and wrung and rinsed again in a basin that grows warm too quickly, no matter how often it's emptied and refilled with fresh well water. You remember the fever first, a heat coming off his small body that you could feel from a foot away without touching him. You remember his mother, Deborah, pressing damp cloths to his forehead through the night, wringing them out in a basin of water that grew warm too quickly, needing to be changed again and again, and you remember the particular sound of that wringing, water twisting and dripping back into the basin over and over, hour after hour, a sound that will return to you unbidden for years afterward at the strangest moments, hauling water for your own bath decades later, the twist and drip of a wet cloth suddenly enough to stop you cold in the middle of an ordinary evening. You remember the pustules appearing on the second day, first to scatter across his chest, then his face, then everywhere, small and raised and terrible, and you remember not being able to hold him properly for fear of the contagion spreading, of losing another child, of losing yourself, standing at the foot of a small bed with your hands useless at your sides because the one thing your body has always known how to do, clean, tend, fix, has no purchase here at all. Within days he was gone, and you spent the rest of your life, decades, correcting a rumour that spread afterward, a rumour that you'd lost him to a botched inoculation rather than to your own hesitation, because the truth that you'd waited too long, that you'd let ordinary circumstance and ordinary dirt and ordinary crowded city air take your son when you could have acted sooner was a truth you could barely stand to look at directly, let alone let other people believe wrongly about you. You write decades later in the one surviving letter that addresses it directly that you have regretted the decision bitterly ever since and would advise every parent to spare no precaution. And even that sentence, spare as it is, costs you visibly. A contemporary who watched you compose it later described your hand trembling slightly over the page, an unusual thing to notice in a man famous for his steadiness. The epidemic that took Francis is not a small, isolated tragedy. It moves through Philadelphia that year the way it moves through every crowded colonial town periodically, in waves, and you watch it take other households on your own street. Watch the small painted signs some families hang on their doors to warn passers-by that sickness is inside. Watch a cart that isn't the night soil cart pass by more than once that season, carrying something smaller and more terrible under a covering cloth. The physicians of the city are divided and mostly powerless, arguing over treatments that do little beyond bleeding and purging a body already fighting for its life. And the general public health wisdom amounts to little more than closing windows against bad air and burning tar in the streets to purify it, neither of which does anything at all against a disease that spreads through direct contact and through air, far more mundane than anyone yet understands. You watch your own neighbours bury children with the same numb, practised grief you're drowning in yourself, and there's a specific, terrible commonality in it. Mothers who scrub their front steps the morning after a burial, with an intensity that has nothing to do with actual dirt and everything to do with needing their hands to do something, anything, while the rest of them is hollowed out. You never fully recover from this, not the way people of your century speak of recovering from grief, quietly, privately, expected simply to carry on. You carry on. In the years afterward, you become one of the loudest, most persistent public advocates for inoculation in the colonies, writing pamphlets, printing statistics in your own newspaper comparing survival rates between the inoculated and the naturally infected, arguing the case in letters to physicians and clergymen who still preach against interfering with what they call the providence of disease. It costs you something every time you write on the subject, because writing about it means holding Francis in your mind deliberately, on purpose, for as long as it takes to compose a clear paragraph of argument, and you do it anyway, dozens of times over the following decades, because the alternative, staying silent and letting another parent make the same mistake in the same fog of hesitation you made it in, is a silence you find you cannot afford, however much it would spare you. Setting the type for your own inoculation pamphlet years after Francis is an odd, private torment you don't discuss with anyone at the shop, not even the journeymen who've worked alongside you long enough to notice when something's weighing on you. Your hands know the motion so thoroughly by now that they can compose a line of type almost without your conscious attention, which means there's nothing to distract you from the content of the words themselves, as your fingers pull each letter from its compartment. The statistics on survival rates, the careful, measured argument for a practice you failed to act on in time for your own son, each letter set backward and upside down the way it's always been set, cold under your fingertips the way it was cold when you were 12 years old and knew nothing yet about what any of this would eventually cost you. You proof the page yourself that evening, alone, after the shop's closed and the other men have gone home, reading the argument through twice by candlelight to check for errors, and somewhere in the second reading your vision blurs briefly. not from the strain of small type in poor light, but from something else entirely, and you set the proof sheet down for a moment, press the heel of one ink-stained hand against your eyes, and simply sit there in the quiet shop until you trust yourself to pick the sheet back up and finish the job properly. The pamphlet prints the following week, distributed to physicians and clergymen and worried parents across the city, and you never once mention in its careful, reasoned pages that the argument was purchased with a 4-year-old's life, because that isn't the kind of fact a persuasive pamphlet needs, however much it's the fact that put the pen in your hand in the first place. A young father comes to your print shop once, years later, a man you barely know beyond his occasional custom for handbills advertising his cooperage business, and he asks you directly, having heard you're something of an authority on the subject, whether he ought to have his own infant son inoculated given the risks the procedure itself carries. You set down the composing stick you're holding, take a moment longer than the question strictly requires, and tell him plainly that you buried a son who wasn't inoculated, that you have never stopped wishing you'd acted sooner, and that the numbers, as best as anyone has recorded them, favour inoculation heavily enough that you would do it again in an instant if given the choice a second time. The man thanks you, quietly, clearly moved by more than he expected from what he'd imagined would be a simple business errand, and he has the child inoculated within the month, and you never learn whether the boy lived to adulthood, whether your words in that particular ordinary afternoon actually changed anything at all, but you think about it anyway, on and off, for years, the way you think about most things you can't verify but choose to believe mattered. But something in you afterward treats disease, dirt, and the body's exposure to a filthy world as a live and present danger, in a way it perhaps wasn't before. Not an abstraction, not merely a moral failing to be tracked in a private ledger, but a mortal threat that took a 4-year-old boy out of your house in the space of a week. When you write, later in life, in your unfinished autobiography about that loss, you're still, decades on, unable to write more than a single, spare, controlled sentence about it. A wound that stayed raw the entire time you were becoming the most famous cleanliness-obsessed eccentric in the English-speaking world. Because that is what happens next. As you grow older, richer, more established, the newspaper thriving, the printing business humming along, Poor Richard's almanac selling by the thousands of copies every autumn, you finally have something you never had as a printer's devil or a starving apprentice in London. The money, the time, and the household staff to actually pursue cleanliness the way your appetite has always wanted you to. And what you do with that freedom is, by the standards of nearly everyone around you, deeply, almost comically strange. You take up what you call air baths. Every single morning for years you get out of bed, and instead of dressing immediately, you sit or walk about your chamber completely naked in front of an open window for half an hour or more, regardless of the season, regardless of the temperature outside. You believe, and you write about this belief at length and seriously to correspondents across 2 continents, that cold air is invigorating to the body in a way that cold water, which everyone else associates with health, is not. That it braces the nerves and refreshes the constitution without the shock of full immersion. Picture it. A heavy-set middle-aged man, entirely undressed, standing at an open window in Philadelphia in the middle of January, gooseflesh rising along his forearms, breath visible in pale clouds, utterly unbothered by how this looks, reading a letter or working through a mathematical problem in his head while the household staff learn to knock twice, loudly, and wait a moment before entering his chamber, because everyone in the house has by now simply accepted that the master does this every single morning, and there is no point remarking on it anymore. The ritual changes texture with the seasons, though the core of it never does. In high summer, the cold air bath is barely cold at all, more a matter of simply sitting unclothed in the early breeze coming through the open sash before the day's heat builds, the linen curtain stirring faintly against your shoulder, birdsong from the garden below carrying up clear and close in the quiet hour before the household properly wakes, and you use that hour for reading more than for any bracing effect, since summer air offers little enough bracing to speak of. In autumn, the air carries a damp, leaf mould sharpness that catches at the back of your throat on the first deep breath, and you can feel the change in temperature settle differently across your body, depending on which way you're turned to the window, one side of you cooler than the other, a small asymmetry you've come to find almost pleasant, proof the air is doing something rather than simply sitting there. Winter is, by any account, the true test of the practice, and the mornings you commit to it fully in January are the mornings your household staff have most fully accepted as simply part of the man they work for. The floor is cold enough underfoot that you keep a small woven mat by the window specifically for standing on, since bare boards in January will numb the soles of your feet within minutes, and you've learned that particular lesson the hard way more than once. Your breath fogs visibly with each exhale, hanging for a moment in the pale light before dispersing, and gooseflesh climbs your forearms and thighs within the first 2 or 3 minutes. A fine, prickling tightness across the skin that you've come to associate, after decades of repetition, not with discomfort exactly, but with a kind of alertness, a sharpening of the mind that no cup of coffee has ever quite matched for you. Your fingertips go faintly numb if you linger past the half hour, clumsy enough that turning a page takes visible effort, and there's always a moment, somewhere in the final 5 minutes, when some part of you, the same part that once told a Boston boy that swimming out too far in a strong current was a mistake, suggest it might be time to close the window and dress. You've learned, across a great many winters now, exactly how long you can push past that suggestion before the alertness curdles into something closer to genuine cold, and you rarely miscalculate anymore, though you did once badly in your 60s, and spent the better part of a week afterward with a head cold severe enough that even you, defender of the practice to the last, allowed privately that perhaps 45 minutes in a Pennsylvania January had been slightly more than the theory strictly called for. A young housemaid new to the household in her first week of service opens his door one January morning without the customary pause, and finds him standing bare at the window, entirely unhurried, a letter held up to catch the grey light, and she freezes in the doorway, mortified, apologising in a rush before fleeing back down the stairs. And it is the cook, later, over the kitchen fire, who explains to her, not unkindly, that this happens every morning, that the master considers it a matter of health, that the household long ago stopped finding it remarkable, and the girl, still faintly scarlet, says she doesn't think she'll ever stop finding it remarkable, and the cook only shrugs and says, "That's Mr. Franklin for you," and goes back to her kneading. Your friends think you're peculiar. Some of them think you're actively dangerous to your own health. The prevailing medical wisdom of the era holds that chilling the body, especially a bare and exposed body, invites exactly the fevers and consumptions that kill people in droves. And here you are, courting that chill on purpose, daily, as a matter of settled personal doctrine, dismissing centuries of accumulated medical caution, with the same brisk confidence you bring to lightning rods and stoves. You write to a friend that you find the practice delightful, that you feel more alert afterward, more capable of clear thought, and you recommend it to others, most of whom decline politely, and probably think privately that Franklin has finally gone entirely round the bend. You also, around this same period, become one of the earliest and most enthusiastic owners in America of something genuinely unusual for the time, a proper bathtub, imported at real expense, a copper vessel shaped almost like a slipper, long enough to recline in, filled with hot water by servants, a laborious process involving heating cauldrons over a kitchen fire and carrying them up flights of stairs, bucket by steaming bucket, the servants' arms straining under the weight, their shoulders aching by the third or fourth trip, until the tub finally holds enough water to actually submerge in, a process that can take the better part of an hour for a single bath, and that virtually nobody else in Philadelphia bothers to undertake even once a month, let alone regularly. You soak in that tub for long stretches, sometimes with a small writing desk balanced across the rim so you can read or write letters while submerged, entirely unembarrassed by how extravagant, how eccentric, how frankly indulgent this looks to neighbours who still believe that full-body bathing more than a few times a year opens a person to fatal chill. You can feel, in that copper tub, the specific pleasure of heat working into muscles that have ached, off and on, since you were a boy hauling chamber pots down 2 flights of stairs before dawn, and there is something almost defiant in how long you linger there, water cooling slowly around you, your skin pruning at the fingertips, refusing to hurry even when a servant knocks gently to remind you of an appointment. Then, in the 1770s and 80s, you go to Paris as an American diplomat, and Paris, it turns out, is where your peculiar private obsession finally, for the first time in your life, finds a culture that doesn't think you're strange at all. The French bathe. Not universally, not the desperately poor, but among the class of physicians, scientists, and fashionable society you now move in as America's most celebrated envoy, bathing is understood, discussed, and practiced with a seriousness that startles you after decades of American and English suspicion. French physicians write treatises on the medicinal benefits of warm baths. Parisian ladies and gentlemen of means have proper bathing rooms built into their houses, tiled, with drains, with dedicated servants whose entire employment concerns hot water and clean linens. There's a whole vocabulary, a whole etiquette, around the practice that simply does not exist back home, and you, an old man now, gouty, overweight, plagued by kidney stones that make ordinary movement an agony, find genuine physical relief in warm mineral baths that ease the ache in your joints in a way nothing else does. Long before Paris, in fact, you had already begun quietly building your own private science of the body, testing the inherited wisdom of your century against your own careful observation, the same way you'd later test lightning against a kite string and a key. Everyone around you, your whole life, has insisted that cold causes colds, that a chill air, a wet shirt, an unheated room will bring on fevers and catarrh as surely as a spark brings fire to dry kindling. And you have never quite believed it, because your own experience keeps contradicting the theory in ways too consistent to dismiss as luck. You have stood soaked through in cold rain for hours at a stretch, chasing an experiment with a kite in a Philadelphia thunderstorm, your shirt plastered flat and freezing against your chest, your fingers numb around the silk ribbon, you're careful to keep dry, even as everything else on you is not, waiting for the charge to build in the string above you, and you caught no fever afterward at all, not so much as a sniffle, despite standing in exactly the conditions every physician in the colonies would have sworn were a death sentence to the lungs. You write eventually a careful letter laying out your reasoning, that sailors and fishermen, wet and cold for entire voyages at a stretch, are often remarkably healthy men, robust in ways that indoor tradesmen kept perpetually warm and dry are not. That colds seem to spread most reliably, not through cold air at all, but through close, crowded, poorly ventilated rooms full of people breathing on one another, which is precisely the condition of nearly every tavern, every packed coach, every overcrowded lodging house you've ever slept in. That the real culprit, as best you can determine from years of your own careful noticing, is not the cold itself, but the foul, stagnant, unwashed air of rooms, where too many unwashed bodies sit too close together for too long. It is not a theory that wins you many converts in your own lifetime. The germ has not yet been discovered. The physicians of your century have no vocabulary for what you're circling around, and most of your correspondents read your letter, admire the wit of it, and go on believing exactly what they believed before. But you keep testing it anyway. Keep standing bareheaded in weather your neighbours consider reckless. Keep sleeping with your bedroom window cracked open through a Pennsylvania winter while your own family shakes their heads at you. Because the evidence, as you read it, keeps pointing the same direction it always has, that a body kept clean and well-aired fares better than a body kept warm and stale, whatever your grandmother might have believed about the dangers of a draught. A French acquaintance, a physician who attends you occasionally at Passy, remarks once, watching you settle into a bath with visible relief, that he finds it curious how the English and Americans regard water with such suspicion, as though it carried some moral danger along with the physical one. We were taught it thins the blood, you tell him, easing your shoulders down until the water reaches your collarbone, steam curling off the surface into the cool evening air of the room. And do you believe that now? I believe, you say, that I have never once caught a fever from a bath, and caught a great many from crowded rooms full of unwashed men breathing on one another. I have come to trust my own observation over inherited caution. He laughs at that, says it is a very American way of putting it, and you don't correct him, though privately you think it is simply the way any printer learns to think. Check the proof against the type, not against what you assumed the type would say. The bathhouse itself, on the days you're taken there rather than bathing at your own lodging in Passy, is unlike anything you encountered in London or Philadelphia. There are tiled rooms, warm from pipes run beneath the floor, and attendants who move with a brisk, unembarrassed professionalism entirely foreign to the furtive, apologetic manner of English servants, hauling bath water up a staircase as though performing something faintly shameful. Steam hangs thick enough in places to blur the far wall, beading on your skin before you've even entered the water proper, and the air smells of hot stone and lavender oil rather than coal smoke and tallow. A combination so unfamiliar after decades of English and colonial air that you find yourself simply standing in it for a moment, breathing, for an attendant gently indicates the bath itself is ready. Your knees, sore from the carriage ride out from Paris, ease almost immediately once you lower yourself into water hot enough to make you exhale sharply through your teeth on first contact. And you sit there afterward for the better part of an hour, while a young Frenchman reads aloud to you from a scientific journal, your gouty foot propped on a cushioned rest just above the waterline, steam curling past both your faces, and you think, not for the first time in this city, that it has taken you 60 years and as ocean crossing to be somewhere that finally agrees with your own body about what it deserves. You write to a Philadelphia friend describing the bathhouse in some detail, half expecting him to find the whole account faintly ridiculous. An old man rhapsodizing about hot water and lavender oil, the way a younger correspondent might rhapsodize about a mistress, and his reply, when it finally crosses the ocean months later, is exactly as sceptical as you predicted, gently suggesting that you've perhaps gone native in your old age, that a true son of Boston oughtn't grow so fond of French indulgence. You compose a response you never actually send, arguing at length that indulgence and health are not always opposites, that a body which has spent 70 years accumulating aches earned through honest labour and honest excess alike is entitled to whatever relief it can find, and that he might reconsider his own stubborn resistance to a warm bath before his own joints teach him the lesson yours have already taught you. In the end, you send a shorter, lighter letter instead, full of jokes rather than argument, because you've learned, across a very long life spent trying to convince other people that cleanliness matters as much as you've always privately believed it does. That argument rarely moves anyone nearly as much as simple, stubborn example eventually does. Paris society, more broadly, is its own study in contrast, and you notice it everywhere once you start looking, the way luxury and filth sit stacked directly on top of one another with barely a wall between them. At Versailles, where you're received with a fanfare and curiosity that startles even a man as used to public attention as you've become, the courtiers move through rooms of staggering opulence, gilt mirrors floor to ceiling, silk upholstery in colours that took entire workshops months to dye correctly, powdered wigs so elaborately built up with pomade and horsehair that the women wearing them can barely turn their heads. And yet the palace itself, you learn from a wry aide who's clearly delighted to shock the visiting American, has almost no proper sanitation at all. Courtiers relieving themselves in stairwells and behind draperies when the walk to a suitable chamber pot proves too inconvenient, the smell of it masked, not eliminated by the very perfume that half of Europe imagines as the height of French refinement. You find yourself almost laughing at the symmetry of it. A nation that has built in its bathhouses and its medical literature one of the most thoughtful cultures of personal cleanliness you've ever encountered, housing its most powerful citizens in a palace that would embarrass a Philadelphia alderman if the actual state of its back stairwells were widely known. Your own lodgings at Passy, by contrast, are modest but scrupulously kept, and you find yourself, in your 70s, receiving a steady stream of visitors, scientists, philosophers, society ladies fascinated by the famous American who apparently believes cold air is good for a man's health. In a chamber where you insist, regardless of your gout, on personally overseeing that the linens are properly aired, that the bath water is drawn fresh rather than reheated from the previous tenant's use, small standards that your French hosts find charming rather than eccentric, a welcome change from decades of English and colonial friends who mostly just found you strange. You refuse, notably, to wear a wig, in a city and a century where nearly every man of any standing at all considers an elaborate powdered wig essential to being taken seriously in polite company, and the refusal is not political, whatever the newspapers later make of it, but almost entirely a matter of your own bodily comfort and your own particular relationship to cleanliness. Wigs, as you've observed at close range for decades now, are breeding grounds, hot, heavy constructions of horsehair and pomade that trap sweat against the scalp, that require their own elaborate maintenance by a dedicated wig maker that you have watched more than once, produce a telltale wriggling when a gentleman's servant sets one down carelessly on a table between wearings, you wear instead, to the genuine delight and mild scandal of Parisian society, a simple fur cap, your own thin grey hair visible beneath it, an image so at odds with the powdered, bewigged elegance surrounding you at every salon and dinner party that it becomes, almost by accident, a kind of fashion of its own, French ladies and gentlemen praising the honest, natural, philosophique simplicity of the famous American sage, never quite guessing that the true motivation sitting underneath the fur cap has far less to do with philosophy than with a boy who once spent 20 minutes, some evenings, dragging a fine-toothed comb through hair crawling with lice, and who decided somewhere in the decades since that he would never again willingly wear anything on his head that gave vermin a place to hide. There's a particular evening at a Parisian salon when a marquise, delighted by your fur cap and your plain brown coat, amid a room otherwise glittering with silk and powder, asks you directly whether you find French fashion excessive, and you tell her, with the same dry courtesy you've always used to deflect a question you don't entirely want to answer honestly, that you find it magnificent to look at and entirely impractical to live inside of, and she laughs, delighted, repeats the line to half the room before the evening's out, and you let her have the joke without correcting the deeper truth of it. Because some things you've learned over 70 years are better kept in a small private ledger than explained aloud at a dinner party. You return to London a third time in your life, decades after the beer-soaked press room and the garret full of vermin and strangers, this time as a colonial agent of real standing, lodging not in a shared attic, but in a comfortable house on Craven Street, kept by a widow named Margaret Stevenson. And the contrast between this London and the one you knew at 18 is so complete that some mornings, walking familiar streets now paved and lamp-lit, where you once picked your way through darkness by memory alone, you find yourself almost disoriented by how thoroughly your own circumstances have inverted themselves. Mrs. Stevenson keeps a household run with the same quiet competence Deborah runs in Philadelphia. Hot water drawn on request rather than begged for or hauled yourself from a shared basin at the bottom of a stairwell. Fresh linen laid out with a regularity that no longer strikes you as luxury so much as the baseline any civilized household ought to maintain. You take your air baths in a proper chamber with a fireplace close enough to warm the room the moment you're ready to dress again, an arrangement considerably kinder to an aging body than the draughty Philadelphia bedroom of your younger years, though you notice with some private amusement that you miss the harder edge of that earlier discomfort just slightly, the way a man sometimes misses a difficulty he's fully outgrown. You return more than once during these Craven Street years to swim, though your body at 50-something moves through the water with none of the reckless speed it had at 18, and there's a particular afternoon on the Thames, cleaner in places than it was decades earlier, though still no water any sensible modern physician would recommend, when a young man on the bank recognises you, having heard the old stories still circulating among London swimmers about the American who once swam from Chelsea to Blackfriars performing tricks the whole way, and asks, half in disbelief, whether the stories are true. You tell him they are, mostly, allowing for the usual exaggeration that attaches itself to any tale told often enough, and he asks whether you still swim that distance now, and you laugh, genuinely, and tell him a man learns eventually which vanities are worth the joint pain the next morning, and this one at your current age is not among them any more, though you wade in anyway for a shorter, gentler stretch, just enough to feel that old, specific cleanliness settle over you one more time. Cold water against skin that has, by now, seen 4 decades more of living than it had the first time this particular river taught it. What relief felt like. Deborah dies while you're still in London, in the December of 1774, and the news reaches you weeks after the fact. The way all news crosses an ocean in this century, delayed just long enough that by the time you read the letter, she's already been in the ground a month, and there was no possibility of your having been there. No version of events in which you might have sat beside her bed, the way you'd once stood helpless at the foot of Francis's. And yet the guilt of it settles into you anyway, unreasoning, familiar, an old visitor returning to a room it's occupied before. You'd been away from Philadelphia for years by then, tending to colonial business in London, and Deborah, in her last letters, had written of failing health, of a stroke that left one side of her weakened, of missing you plainly and without much complaint. The kind of restrained longing that a woman of her generation was trained to express only sparingly, and you had meant, always, to return sooner, the way you'd once meant to have Francis inoculated sooner, and the pattern of it, good intentions arriving a season too late, is not lost on you, alone in a rented London room, holding a letter that tells you your wife of over 40 years is already buried an ocean away. You think, that night and for many nights afterward, about the specific domestic cleanliness she brought into your life without either of you ever discussing it directly. The wash day she never once let slip in decades of marriage. The fresh linen simply appearing on schedule the way weather appears. The quiet competence that let you stop calculating, every single morning, how many more days a collar could be stretched before it embarrassed you. It is, you realise, far too late to tell her so, one of the more profound gifts anyone has ever given you, and you never properly thanked her for it, not directly, not in so many words, because it had simply become the invisible architecture of your household, noticed only in memory, only now, only from 3,000 miles away with a black-bordered letter open on the table in front of you. Your gout, by this point, is a near-constant companion, and it deserves its own honest accounting because it is disgusting in its own particular way. Not filth exactly, but the indignity of a body that has become, after decades of rich food and good wine and a sedentary life spent mostly at a writing desk, its own kind of prison. Your big toe swells hot and red and so exquisitely tender that the weight of a bedsheet against it is enough to make you cry out in the middle of the night, waking whoever sleeps nearest with a sound you'd be embarrassed by if the pain left room for embarrassment. You write, with characteristic wit even in genuine misery, an entire dialogue between yourself and the personified spirit of the gout, in which the gout scolds you for your gluttony and your idleness with a viciousness you can't really argue against, because you know, better than anyone, that you've earned this pain through decades of good living and insufficient exercise. Let us examine your course of life, the gout says to you, in the dialogue you compose for your own private amusement and later share with friends. Amid all your delights, was there not something like a call, a whisper in your ear that said, "Franklin, this is delicious, but it is not without consequences. Your inordinate appetite for the good things of the table. Did you not know that a man who eats and drinks as you do ought to walk at least 4 or 5 miles a day?" You have no honest answer to give the gout, and the joke of the dialogue is precisely that you can't win the argument, that the gout knows your own habits better than you're willing to admit to your friends, and there's a particular flavour of self-mockery in writing it, that lets you hold the pain at arm's length for the length of a page, even while your actual foot, under actual blankets, throbs in time with your pulse hard enough to keep sleep away for hours. A bad night with the gout has its own specific architecture, one you've come to know intimately over the years, the way you once knew the layout of a composing case well enough to find any letter blind. It begins, usually in the small hours, with a warmth in the joint that at first feels almost pleasant, a low heat you might mistake for simple circulation if you hadn't felt it turn, every single time, into something else within the hour. The heat sharpens into a throbbing that keeps time with your own pulse, a pressure building beneath skin that has by morning gone taut and shiny and faintly discoloured, red shading toward purple at the worst of it, so tender that even the slight weight of a linen sheet drawn across your foot is enough to make you gasp aloud in the dark, waking whoever's nearest with a sound you'd be humiliated by if the pain left any room at all for humiliation. You lie rigid, afraid to shift even slightly, because shifting means the joint moves, and the joint moving means a fresh wave of pain sharp enough to make your eyes water in the dark. Sweat breaking cold across your forehead and the back of your neck despite the actual chill of the room, your hands gripping the edge of the mattress hard enough that your knuckles ache, along with everything else, by the time dawn finally, mercifully, arrives. The kidney stones announce themselves differently, with less warning and considerably more violence. A deep, twisting pain low in your back and side that comes in waves rather than a steady burn, each wave building for what feels like a full minute before it crests and briefly, incompletely recedes, only to build again moments later, and you have learned, across several attacks, that there is no position that actually helps, though you try all of them anyway out of sheer desperation. Doubled forward in a chair, stretched flat despite the greater pressure it brings, pacing slowly with one hand braced against the wall, your jaw clenched so hard against crying out that your teeth ache the next day along with everything else. Sweat soaks through your nightshirt during the worst of it, cold and clammy against your back within minutes, and your hands shake faintly whenever you try to hold a cup of water steady enough to drink from it. The opium eventually blurring the edges of the pain into something survivable, rather than removing it outright, and you sit in that half-dulled state for hours afterward, present enough to dictate a letter if pressed, but distant enough that the words come slower than usual, your secretary waiting patiently between sentences while you gather enough of yourself to finish a thought. Getting out of bed on a bad morning is its own ordeal. You cannot simply stand, cannot bear weight on the swollen joint, and you're forced to rely on servants to half carry you the few steps to a chair. Your dignity, at 70-something, reduced to being lifted like an infant by people half your age, your face burning with an embarrassment that decades of fame and diplomatic triumph do nothing to soften. The servant's hands under your arms, the awkward shuffle of feet trying to match your feet, the small grunt of effort neither of you acknowledges out loud, the chair's cushion finally taking your weight with a small exhale of trapped air. All of it a daily humiliation so ordinary by now that you no longer flinch at it, though you remember, with a clarity that surprises you, the exact opposite sensation from 60 years earlier. Your own young arms cutting cleanly through Thames water, entirely self-sufficient, needing nobody's hands at all. The dialogue with the gout continues, in your imagination and eventually on paper, well past that first exchange, because the pain itself refuses to be brief, and you find some private relief in dragging the argument out across an entire sleepless night. You philosophers are sages in your maxims and fools in your conduct, the gout tells you at one point, and you protest weakly. that you have at least given up the heaviest of your former excesses, that you eat with more restraint now than you did as a younger man, flush with success, and eager to prove he could finally afford a well-laid table. The gout is not moved. But are you still such a glutton as to eat suppers? It asks, and you have no honest reply because you are in fact still such a glutton, and the two of you both know it, and there's something almost companionable in being caught out so thoroughly by a condition that is, after all, only your own body talking back to you in a voice sharper than your own conscience usually bothers to use. Toward dawn, the pain eases enough that you finally sleep an hour or two, and when you wake the dialogue feels, in the clear light of morning, less like torment and more like the closest thing you have to genuine self-examination anymore. A private confession extracted from you by nothing more mystical than an inflamed joint and too many good suppers, delivered in a voice that sounds uncomfortably exactly like your own. The kidney stones are worse. By your final years back in Philadelphia after returning from Paris, the stones have grown large enough that ordinary bodily functions become a private torment you rarely discuss openly, but that consumes hours of every difficult day. Waiting, sweating, gripping the arms of a chair, for the stone to pass or to simply ease enough that you can move again. Opium the only thing that dulls it enough to let you sleep, and even then only in a chair propped nearly upright, because lying flat sends new waves of pressure and pain radiating through you that keep sleep entirely out of reach. You dictate letters from that chair some nights, your voice steady even when your hands are not, because the one skill 9 years of apprenticeship never managed to strip out of you is the ability to keep working through discomfort, and old habits, it turns out, outlast almost everything else. Servants and family members handle intimate physical tasks for you, now that you handled entirely alone as a young apprentice sneaking off to swim in the Thames, and there is something almost unbearably poignant in that arc if you step back and look at the whole shape of it. The boy who discovered in cold harbour water that his body could feel clean and free and strong, ending his life dependent on other hands simply to be moved from a bed to a chair. And yet, even here, even now, the old habits persist, stubborn as ever. You still take your air baths when your body allows it, still sit undressed by an open window some mornings, an old man's pale, swollen-jointed body exposed to the Philadelphia air the way it was exposed 40 years earlier, and something in that persistence feels less like eccentricity now, and more like defiance, a refusal to let a failing body's indignities erase the one private ritual that has always, since London, since the Thames, made you feel that cleanliness was something you could claim for yourself rather than something the world granted or withheld from you. You think in these final years, writing letters, revising your will, dictating portions of the autobiography you never quite managed to finish, about how strange the whole arc has been. A boy born into a Boston household that considered bathing dangerous. An apprentice with lead dust worked permanently into his fingerprints and lice in his hair, and a body that stank in ways he could no longer detect, because he had lived inside that stink for so many years it had simply become the smell of being alive. A teenager who ran away with dirty shirts stuffed in his pockets, because there was nowhere else to put them, gnawing bread rolls on a Philadelphia street while a future wife watched from a doorway and thought him ridiculous. A young man who found, almost by accident, that submerging himself in cold, filthy river water could produce a feeling so pure and so pleasurable that strangers on pleasure boats gathered to watch him do it, that a wealthy Englishman offered to fund a swimming academy around his talent alone, that the same water nearly took him under one forgotten afternoon in Boston Harbour, and taught him fear had a price he was still willing to pay, a father who lost a son to a disease that moved easily through the unwashed, crowded conditions everyone around him had simply accepted as the unavoidable texture of daily life, and who spent the rest of his days half defending, half tormented by, the decision he hadn't made in time. A middle-aged eccentric who stood naked in front of open windows in the dead of a Pennsylvania winter, while his household staff learned not to remark on it, who imported a copper bathtub at outrageous expense, and had water hauled up flights of stairs, bucket by scalding bucket, just so he could soak while reading letters, decades before anyone else on his side of the ocean thought to bother. An old diplomat in Paris who finally found, in a culture willing to take bathing seriously, some measure of relief for a body racked by gout and stone, who traded jokes about English suspicion of water with a French physician, while steam curled off his own bath water into a cool evening room, and now at the end a very old man still trying some mornings, when his joints allow it, to stand bare in the cold air one more time, chasing the same feeling that first found him as a teenager gasping at the shock of Boston Harbour water against his chest, the simple, stubborn, oddly moral conviction that a body deserved to be clean, that this was not vanity but a kind of dignity, the one dignity that had been almost entirely absent from every filthy, ink-stained, lice-bitten, lead-poisoned day of his apprenticeship, and that he had spent the rest of his life quietly, eccentrically, insistently trying to reclaim. The last Atlantic crossing in 1785, coming home from Paris for good, is nothing at all like the crossing you made at 18 with dirty shirts stuffed in your pockets, and the difference tells you, more plainly than any mirror could, exactly how far your body has travelled alongside the rest of you. You cannot walk aboard under your own power this time. The stones and the gout together have left you unable to manage a ship's gangway, let alone the pitching deck beyond it, and so you are carried up in a sedan chair, an indignity you accept with more grace than you actually feel, aware of the sailors watching, aware of the particular vulnerability of being lifted and jostled by strangers whose grip you can only trust and not control. Your joints protesting every small shift of the chair with a sharp, private wince. You try to keep off your face for the sake of the small crowd gathered dockside to see the famous doctor off. Below decks, your cabin has been arranged with more care than any berth you knew in 1724, a proper bed rather than a hammock, a basin kept filled by an attentive steward, the worst of the voyage's inevitable dampness kept somewhat at bay by careful housekeeping that would have seemed like sorcery to the 18-year-old who once spent 9 miserable days below decks bracing against slosh and bilge water. And yet the fundamental facts of an ocean crossing haven't changed at all in 60 years. The cramped air, the constant motion, the smell of too many bodies confined too long in too small a space. And you spend a good deal of the voyage simply enduring it, the same way you endured it as a young man, only now with considerably less resilience to draw on and considerably more time, given how slowly you move these days, to notice every discomfort in full. The final illness, when it comes, in the spring of 1790, is an infection settling deep in one lung, and it takes you slowly enough that you have time to understand day by day that this is the one your body will not recover from. Your daughter Sally sits with you through most of it, and there is a specific afternoon, a week or so before the end, when the fever has broken just enough that you're lucid and calm, and she suggests gently that you might lie on your side, that the position might ease your breathing, and you tell her the last recorded words attributed to you, spoken with what witnesses describe as a kind of dry, settled clarity, that a dying man can do nothing easy, a small joke at your own expense that is, in its way, entirely consistent with everything else you've ever said about the indignities of a failing body, the same wit you brought to the dialogue with the gout decades earlier, turned now on the plainest fact left to face. Even in those final days, propped in bed, too weak to manage the stairs, let alone stand undressed at an open window, you ask more than once for the room to be aired, for the linens to be changed, for a basin of clean water kept near enough that your face and hands can be washed without your having to move much at all. Small request that the household staff, long accustomed to your particular standards, carries out without comment or surprise. It is in the end a fairly ordinary way to want to die. Clean, aired, tended. Except that it wasn't ordinary at all for the boy who woke in a Boston loft 70 years earlier to the smell of hot metal and his own unwashed body, who had no basin, no clean linen, no expectation that a room should ever be aired for his comfort, who learned, slowly, stubbornly, across an entire long life, that this particular dignity was one he'd have to build for himself, plank by plank, bath by bath, dot by careful dot in a little book nobody else ever fully understood the weight of. It is late now, wherever and whenever you are listening to this. The candle by your own bed has likely burned low, the way candles always eventually do, and your body, whatever century it belongs to, is tired in the particular way bodies get tired at the end of a long day. Muscles loosening, thoughts slowing, the small aches of ordinary living finally allowed to rest. You do not have lead dust worked into your fingerprints. You do not share a chamber pot with 3 other apprentices. Do not carry it steaming and heavy down 2 flights of stairs before dawn. Do not sit shivering on a splintered privy seat, with your breath fogging in the cold. You do not smell, most likely, the particular stew of coal smoke and unwashed wool and low-tide river stench that filled every street Franklin ever walked as a young man. Some quiet miracle of plumbing and soap and hot water on demand has spared you nearly everything this old printer spent a lifetime hungering for and rarely getting enough of. Centuries will pass. The Boston loft you never saw but can now almost smell will be gone. Its timber and wattle long since rotted or burned, or simply built over by a city that forgot it was ever there. The Thames Gate warned you about. The Thames you swam from Chelsea to Blackfriars while strangers watched from a pleasure boat will be dredged and embanked and eventually cleaned by engineers whose names you'll never know, working centuries after your own bones have settled into Christchurch burial ground. The privies will become pipes, the chamber pots will become porcelain fixtures with handles that release clean water at a touch. No carry-in, no sloshing, no gutter running down the centre of any street. The gin shops and the beer-soaked pressrooms will give way to other vices, other rooms, other arguments about what a body ought to be allowed to do to itself, but people will still wake in the dark not knowing for half a second where they are. People will still notice the smell of a room before they notice anything else about it. People will still feel that specific private relief of hot water against tired skin, will still stand for a moment at an open window in cold air and feel, however briefly, more awake than they were a moment before. Some things don't change. The body's memory of what it means to finally feel clean doesn't change. The particular gratitude of a warm bed after a hard day doesn't change either. You are warm enough, fed enough, clean enough in whatever way your own century has made possible, which is very likely far cleaner than a printer's boy in 1718 Boston could have imagined, even in his most extravagant daydreams about someday owning a proper bathtub. You have water that arrives at the turn of the handle, and soap that doesn't strip the skin raw to do its work, and a bed that nobody else's chamber pot has ever stood beside. That is more than a great many people who came before you ever had. That is enough. Let it come then. Let sleep take you the way it eventually took an old man in a chamber at Passy with a French physician's voice still faintly in his ears, the way it took him again decades later in a Philadelphia bedroom with his daughter close by, and a joke about dying easily still hanging gently in the air. Let the noise of your own particular day fade the way the noise of every city in every century eventually fades once the candle's out. Let your thoughts slow and soften, and finally stop circling whatever they've been circling since morning. You've earned this rest, the plain, unglamorous, uncomplicated rest of a body that worked hard and is now allowed to simply stop. Somewhere, in memory if nowhere else, an old man is still soaking in a copper tub, water hauled up by hand bucket after steaming bucket, a letter balanced on a small desk across the rim, easing joints that ache the way joints ache after a very long life, entirely unembarrassed, entirely himself, in no hurry at all to climb out. Let him rest there a while longer, in the warm water, in the quiet. Let yourself rest here in yours. Good night,